This video is for section 5.7. Our objectives in this video are to solve quadratic equations by factoring and solve problems using polynomial equations. So when we're solving a quadratic equation by factoring, we need to have the quadratic equation in what's called standard form. And we talked about standard form for linear equations. Standard form for a quadratic equation is a little bit different. You have a term with x squared, you may have a term with x and a constant term, and then all of those terms are on the same side of the equal sign. You have 0 on the other side of the equal sign. So one side of the equation is 0. We need to have the equation in standard form because we're going to use something called the zero product principle. And the zero product principle states that if we have two numbers that are multiplied together, numbers or algebraic expressions that are multiplied together, so if a times b equals 0, then one of those two must be 0. So then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. The only way that two numbers can multiply to be 0, if you think about your multiplication facts, the only way that two numbers can multiply to be 0 is if one of them is 0 or both of them could be 0. So we know that if two things multiply and it equals 0, then one of them at least must be 0. So we're going to use this to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So the steps to this process, the first step is to put the equation in standard form if it isn't already. So obtain a 0 on one side. If necessary. If you already have 0 on one side, then you can go right to step 2. Step 2 is to factor. And the reason that we need to factor is that we need to have things that are multiplied together in order to use the zero product principle. So we need to have the equation in terms of having things that are multiplied together. So we're going to factor, then we're going to set each factor equal to 0. And we can say each factor containing a variable equal to 0. And then step 4 is to solve each of the equations from step 3. So with these problems, oftentimes we're going to have multiple answers because you're going to get more than one factor, and each factor is going to result in a different answer. So we're going to look first at a problem that's in the text. This is on page 382. It's not one of the example problems, but it's a little bit simpler, and I wanted to kind of start with the most basic type of problem. So this problem says to solve x squared minus 12x plus 27 equals 0. We already have 0 on one side, so we can go right to the factoring step. I'm going to factor this into two sets of parentheses. And I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 27 and add to negative 12. That's going to be negative 9 and negative 3. Then I set each factor or each set of parentheses equal to 0. And then I solve for x for each. So add 3 to both sides, I get x equals 3. Add 9 to both sides, and I get x equals 9. So those are two answers. Looking at entering these answers into the homework. The homework problems are going to look like this. It says use factoring to solve. You can check by substitution or using a graphing calculator and identifying x-intercepts, and the book goes into more detail on that. So when you're entering your answers, what's important is that it says use a comma to separate answers as needed. Type repeated roots only once, and we'll talk about that in a second. So when you're typing into the box, you notice that there is the bracket here. So you're going to type the numbers separated by commas, but you're not going to put them in parentheses. Remember, this is not going to be an ordered pair. So you just type the number, comma, and then type the second number. So for this one, my two answers are going to be 9 and -4. So I'm going to type 9, comma, -4. Or I could type -4 first, doesn't matter. And then check my answer, and that's correct. Again, remember, do not put parentheses around the ordered pair for these because this is not a coordinate pair. It's not an XY coordinate pair. So next we're going to look at example 2. There's actually 3 parts to this. I spread it out so that I would have enough room to write. So part A says to solve 5x squared equals 20x. So what I notice here is that I don't have 0 on one side, so that needs to be my first step. When you're putting 0 on one side, what you generally always want to do, if you can, is keep the leading coefficient positive. So, in this I have 5x squared equals 20x. I need to subtract one of these to move it over to the other side. I want to keep the 5 in front of x squared positive because that's the leading coefficient, so I'm going to subtract the 20x. So that's going to give me 5x squared minus 20x equals 0. Now this factors a little bit differently than the first example because I don't have a constant term here. I just have x in 2 terms. So remember, when you're thinking about factoring, what you want to factor out first is a GCF. And so looking at this, I see that I have a GCF of 5x. So that's what I'm going to factor out. That's going to leave me with x minus 4 equals 0. So now these are my 2 factors. I set each one equal to 0 and solve the equation. Now for this equation, to get rid of the 5, I divide both sides by 5. 0 divided by 5 is 0. 0 divided by anything is 0. So for this equation, I get x equals 0 as an answer. And then for this one, add 4 to both sides, and I get x equals 4. So what I would type in here would be 0, 4. Now we have question B. So this one, again, we have to move some things over first because we do not have 0 on one side. I want to keep the leading coefficient positive, so I want to keep x squared positive, so I need to move these things over. So minus 8x from both sides, and then plus 12 to both sides. We're using our solving equations rules to move things over here. Now, what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to combine like terms. I'm going to have x squared minus 8x, and then the 4 and 12 add together to be plus 16. And the right side is going to be 0. Now I want to factor this. 2 numbers that multiply to 16 and add to -8 are going to be minus 4 and minus 4. Now, what I have here is I have the same set of parentheses. X minus 4, x minus 4. So this is what it mentioned in the homework when it said to type repeated solutions only once, because what I'm going to do here is I don't have to do this twice because x minus 4 equals 0. I'm going to get the same thing when I do it a second time. So I get x equals positive 4. That's just the answer. So they do not want you to type 4, 4 for this. They just want you to type 4. So that's what that means. And you'll see that in one of the homework problems where this is going to happen. So only type the answer once if the 2 sets of parentheses are exactly the same. Lastly, we're going to look at C. And you might think, oh, this is easy because it's already factored. The problem is that we do not have 0 on the right side of the equation. So I can't just say, oh, I have x minus 7 equals 0 and x plus 5 equals 0 because I don't have 0 on the right side. What I need to do is use FOIL first to multiply this out, then move the negative 20 over. So I'm going to use FOIL on this. I'm going to combine my like terms. That's x squared minus 2x minus 35. Now I need to add 20 to both sides to get 0 on the right side. So now that I have 0 on the right side, what I'm going to do is factor this. Notice I'm not going to get the same factors that I originally started with because my constant has changed. So now this is going to factor into x minus 5 times x plus 3, two numbers that multiply to negative 15 and add to negative 2. Now I'm going to set each of these factors equal to 0. And solve each equation. So that gives me x equals 5. And the second one is going to give me x equals negative 3. So I would type 5 comma negative 3 or negative 3 comma 5 in for the answer. So what you should do next is checkpoint problem number 2. One thing I want to say about this problem is, unlike in the examples, when you do question A, it's going to be a little bit different. You should get one answer that's a fraction. And you can look in the notes that are posted to see the answer for that if you're having trouble. But the answer for A in this case is going to be a fraction. So just be careful with that. So do these problems in your notes, check your answers in the notes that are posted, and then you can move on to the homework.